Cornelius Blackthorne's calloused hands trembled as he poured water from the ceramic pitcher into the wash basin, each drop echoing like thunder in the suffocating silence of their honeymoon cabin. His bride of 3 hours sat hunched on the edge of their marriage bed. Her wedding dress a simple cream muslin she'd sewn herself bunched around her like crumpled paper. The scar that carved a jagged path from her left temple to her jaw caught the lamplight, and she turned away instinctively. "I'm sorry I'm ugly," Ophelia whispered, the words barely audible above the creek babbling outside their window in the remote Arkansas hills. Cornelius froze, water still streaming from the pitcher at his broad shoulders, which had carried timber, and grief in equal measure for 34 years began to shake. Not with revulsion, as Ophelia feared, but with rage not at her, but at every cruel word that had carved itself into her heart deeper than any physical wound ever could. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Outside, the September wind rattled the cabin's rough-hewn walls, and somewhere in the distance, a screech owl called into the darkness. Cornelius had waited 2 years to marry her, ever since the sawmill accident that had left half her face permanently marked. He'd watched her retreat from town gatherings, seen her flinch when children stared, witnessed her beautiful spirit slowly suffocating under the weight of others. It's thoughtless cruelty. He set the pitcher down with deliberate care and turned to face her. Ophelia's good eye, still that startling shade of violet he'd fallen in love with 5 years ago, refused to meet his gaze. Her auburn hair, which she now wore long to partially hide her scars, cascaded over one shoulder like autumn leaves. "Look at me," he said, his voice rougher than usual. She shook her head, pulling her hair forward like a curtain. "Ophelia." His boots creaked against the floorboards as he crossed to her. "Look at me." When she finally raised her head, tears were streaming down both sides of her face, the unmarked side and the scarred side alike. Cornelius knelt before her, his weathered hands reaching up to cup her face with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone so large and work-worn. "You think I married you out of pity?" he asked. She nodded, fresh tears spilling over. "You think I spent 2 years waiting for your answer out of charity?" Another nod. Cornelius leaned back on his heels, studying her face in the lamplight. The scar tissue had healed in ridged patterns, pulling slightly at the corner of her left eye and mouth. To him, it looked like lightning frozen in skin, powerful, unique, and somehow beautiful in its fierce permanence. "Then you don't know me at all," he said quietly. "And you sure as hell don't know what love looks like." He rose and walked to the small wooden chest he'd brought from his own cabin. Inside, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, lay something he'd been working on for months. His hands, more accustomed to axes and saws than delicate work, had struggled with every detail. The silence in the cabin had shifted. No longer suffocating, but expectant, like the moment before dawn breaks over the mountain ridges. Ophelia watched through her tears as Cornelius unwrapped his mysterious bundle, his massive fingers working with surprising delicacy. What emerged made her breath catch in her throat, a hand mirror, but not just any mirror. The handle was carved from oak, the same oak from the tree where he'd first kissed her 6 years ago, and inlaid with tiny pieces of colored glass that caught the lamplight like captured stars. But it was the frame that made her heart stop. Carved into the wood in intricate detail was the story of lightning. Not the destructive kind that split trees and burned barns, but the kind that illuminated. The sky revealed hidden beauty in storm clouds and painted the heavens with electric fire. Each carved bolt twisted and danced around the mirror's edge. And she realized with a shock that he'd spent months, maybe years, creating this. "My grandmother told me something once," Cornelius said, settling beside her on the bed, the mirror cradled in his palms like something sacred. She said lightning never strikes the same place twice because it doesn't need to. One strike changes everything forever. Ophelia's fingers traced the carved lightning bolts, her scarred hand running over the smooth wood. "The night of your accident," Cornelius continued, his voice steady but thick with emotion, "I was the one who carried you from the mill to Doc Patterson's. Your face was torn open, blood everywhere, and all I could think was that I might lose you before I ever told you how I felt. She remembered fragments of that night, the screaming saw blade that caught a knot in the wood and kicked back, the explosion of pain, the taste of blood and sawdust, but she'd never known it was Cornelius. Who'd found her? Who'd run 3 miles through the dark with her bleeding in his arms? When you finally healed enough to see visitors, you wouldn't look at me. Hell, you wouldn't look at anybody. And I realized you thought the accident had changed everything between us. He lifted the mirror, angling it so she had no choice but to see herself. But lightning had already struck Ophelia. 5 years before that accident, the first time I saw you singing in the church choir, in the mirror she saw her face as it was now half familiar, half transformed. The scar tissue caught the light differently than her unmarked skin, creating shadows and highlights that seemed to shift and dance. For the first time since the accident, she didn't immediately look away. "You see a ruined woman," Cornelia said. Softly, "I see the same person who used to sneak me her mama's cornbread after Sunday service. The same woman who sat with old Mrs. Crawford every day during her final illness, reading her stories until her voice went hoarse. The same stubborn, beautiful soul who told me she'd rather die than marry a man who felt sorry for her." He shifted the mirror slightly, and the carved lightning seemed to come alive in the lamplight, dancing around her reflection like a crown. "This scar doesn't make you ugly, Ophelia. It makes you mine, 'cause every time I look at it, remember the night I almost lost the most important thing in my world, and how I swore to God that if he'd let you live, I'd spend the rest of my life making sure you knew how precious you are." Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, a real storm approaching the mountains. But inside their small cabin, another kind of storm was breaking. Years of self-hatred, of hiding and shame, began to crack under the steady pressure of his words. Ophelia took the mirror from his hands. Holding it up to study her reflection properly for the first time in 2 years, the mirror trembled in Ophelia's hands as she stared at her reflection, really looking for the first time since the accident. In the dancing lamplight, with the carved lightning seeming to move around the frame, her scar didn't look like the hideous disfigurement she'd imagined. It looked like what Cornelius had called it lightning, frozen in flesh, wild and permanent. "And somehow powerful. I used to dream about you," she whispered, her voice so soft he had to lean closer to hear. "Before the accident, I mean. I'd dream about our wedding day, about you lifting my veil and seeing my face and thinking I was beautiful." Cornelius's jaw tightened. "And now I have nightmares about it, about you seeing me and regretting everything." She set the mirror in her lap, her fingers still tracing the carved oak. "The whole town thinks you're marrying me out of Christian charity. Even Pastor Williams asked if you were sure you wanted to go through with it." The thunder outside grew closer, and the first drops of rain began pattering against the cabin windows. Cornelius stood abruptly, pacing to the wash basin, where the water still sat undisturbed. His reflection wavered on its surface as he gripped the rim with white knuckles. "What did you tell him?" he asked without turning around. "I told him I'd release you from the engagement if you wanted. That I'd understand if, goddammit, Ophelia." The words exploded from him with such force that she flinched. He spun around, his face flushed with anger, but when he saw her shrinking into herself, his expression immediately softened. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to curse, especially not on our wedding night, but hearing that you offered to let me go..." Returned to her side, kneeling again so they were at eye level. "Do you remember the first time I kissed you? Under the old oak by Miller's Creek?" She nodded, a ghost of a smile touching the unmarked corner of her mouth. "You had flour in your hair from helping your mama with the church bake sale. Your hands were sticky from rolling out pie crusts, and you were worried I'd think you looked a mess." He reached out, tucking a strand of auburn hair behind her ear on her scarred side, the gesture deliberate and tender. "I thought you were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. You want to know what I was thinking about during our wedding ceremony today?" Ophelia shook her head, not trusting her voice. "I was thinking about how that same flour-dusted woman just promised to love me until death parts us. How lucky I am that she said yes when half the eligible bachelors in 3 counties would give anything for the chance I'm getting." His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, right along the edge of the scarred tissue. I was thinking about how she's been hiding from me for 2 years. And now I finally get to convince her that she's been wrong about everything. The storm outside was building in earnest now, rain drumming against the roof in a steady rhythm. Lightning flashed beyond the windows, illuminating the cabin in brief, stark moments of blue-white clarity. Each flash seemed to emphasize Cornelius's words, as if nature itself was agreeing with him. "I brought something else," he said, reaching into his vest pocket. What he pulled out made Ophelia's breath catch. A photograph, slightly crumpled from being carried close to his heart. It showed her from before the accident, sitting on the church steps in her Sunday dress, laughing at something outside the camera's view. "This is how the town remembers you," he said, holding up the photograph. Then he lifted the mirror again, angling it so she could see both images side by side. "But this is how I see you now. Different, yes, but not less. Never less." Lightning crashed overhead, so close it shook the cabin's foundation, and in that brilliant moment of illumination, something shifted in Ophelia's chest, loosening of the tight band of shame that had constricted her breathing for 2 long years. She looked from the photograph to her reflection and back again, beginning to see what Cornelius saw, not a before and after, but 2 chapters of the same story. "The children in town," she said hesitantly. "They stare at me. Some of them cry. When they see me coming, children stare at everything unusual until they understand it," Cornelius replied, settling beside her on the bed so their shoulders touched. "My nephew Timothy was terrified of my beard until he realized it was just hair growing in a different place. Now he won't stop asking when he'll grow one too." Despite herself, Ophelia smiled. She remembered Timothy, barely 6 years old, with his gap-toothed grin and endless questions. "What about the adults? Mrs. Henderson crosses the street when she sees me. The Brewster twins whisper behind their fans at church." Cornelius was quiet for a moment, listening to the storm rage outside, their sanctuary. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of carefully considered words. "Some folks have small hearts, Ophelia. They see anything different and think it's something to fear or pity. But that says more about them than it does about you." He stood and walked to the window, peering out into the storm-lashed darkness. "You know what I see when I look at this scar? I see proof that you survived something that would have killed a weaker person. I see evidence of your strength, your resilience. I see a woman who's been through hell and came out the other side still kind enough to worry about other people's comfort." Another lightning strike illuminated the landscape outside the creek, swollen with rain, trees bending but not breaking in the wind. Ophelia watched her husband's silhouette against the window and felt something warm unfurling in her chest, pushing against the cold walls she'd built around her heart. "I haven't sung since the accident," she admitted quietly, "which I used to love. Singing in the choir, but now I feel like people stare at my face instead of listening to the music." Cornelius turned from the window, his expression thoughtful. "Do you remember the song you were humming the day I first worked up the courage to speak to you?" She shook her head. "Amazing Grace. You were hanging laundry behind your parents' house, and you were humming so softly I almost didn't hear it. But it was the most beautiful sound I'd ever encountered." He crossed back to her, extending his hand, palm up, an invitation. "Sing it for me now, Cornelius. I can't." "My voice isn't your voice is yours," he interrupted gently. "It doesn't belong to the congregation or the town gossips or anyone else. It's yours to give or keep as you choose. I'm asking you to share it with your husband." The word husband sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the storm outside. She placed her scarred hand in his unmarked one, marveling at how perfectly they fit together despite their differences. Her voice, when it came, was rusty from disuse and thick with emotion. But it carried the melody he remembered, "Amazing Grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." ... As she sang, Cornelius watched her face transform. The tension that had become her constant companion began to ease. Her good eye closed, then opened, then her scarred eye followed suit. By the time she reached was blind, but now I see. Tears were streaming down both sides of her face, but they were different tears now, cleaner somehow. washing away years of accumulated shame. When the last note faded, the storm outside seemed to pause, as if nature itself had been listening. "There she is," Cornelius whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "There's my bride." The silence that followed Ophelia's song was different from the crushing quiet that had filled the cabin earlier. This silence hummed with possibility, with the space between them finally cleared of shame and misunderstanding. Cornelius still held her scarred hand in both of his thumbs tracing gentle circles across her knuckles. "I have a confession," Ophelia said, her voice stronger now, as if the singing had unlocked something that had been trapped in her throat for years. "The day you asked me to marry you, after I said yes, I cried for 3 hours." Cornelius's brow furrowed with concern, but she quickly continued. "Happy tears, mostly, but also terrified ones, because I realized I'd been so focused on what I'd lost that I'd forgotten what I still had to give." She lifted their joined hands, studying the contrast between her marked skin and his unmarked flesh. "I kept thinking about our children. What if they inherit this? What if people look at our family and see something broken?" The storm outside was beginning to move on, the thunder growing more distant, but the rain continued its steady drumming. Against the roof, Cornelius released her hand only long enough to retrieve something else from his wooden chest. A small leather journal, its pages worn from frequent handling. "I've been writing," he said, opening the journal to a page near the beginning. "Letters to our future children, things I want them to know." Ophelia's eyes widened. She'd had no idea he kept a journal, much less one about their hypothetical family. "I read you something?" At her nod, he cleared his throat and began. "Dear little ones, your mama thinks her scars make her ugly, but she's wrong. They make her powerful. They're proof that she survived something terrible and chose to keep loving. Anyway, when you're old enough to understand, I'll tell you about the night she was hurt, how brave she was, and how much stronger she became." He turned the page. "She thinks people will look at our family and see something broken, but broken things can be beautiful too. A tree struck by lightning doesn't die, it grows around the wound, becomes stronger at the point of impact. That's what love does. It doesn't erase the hard things. It grows around them, through them, until they become part of something bigger and more beautiful than what came before." Ophelia was crying again, but these tears felt like healing, like rain after a long drought. "You really think we could have children? That it would be fair to them?" "I think any child lucky enough to have you as a mother would be blessed beyond measure," Cornelius said firmly. "And if anyone ever dares to make them feel otherwise, they'll answer to me." She laughed, through her tears at the fierce protectiveness in his voice. "You sound like you're planning to fight the whole world. If that's what it takes." He closed the journal and set it aside, then stood and began unbuttoning his shirt. Ophelia's breath caught, suddenly aware that they were married now, that this was their wedding night, that everything was about to change. But instead of the shame and fear she'd expected to feel, she found herself curious, even eager. When Cornelius pulled his shirt over his head, she saw his torso properly for the first time, broad and muscled from years of hard labor, but also marked. A long white scar ran from his left shoulder blade to his ribs, and smaller scars dotted his arms and hands. "My turn for confessions," he said, sitting back down beside her. "I got this one when I was 14, fell off the barn roof trying to patch a hole before a storm. This one," he touched a puckered mark on his forearm, "happened when I was learning to work the forge." And these, he held up his hands, showing her the countless small scars from splinters. "Cuts and burns are from every day of honest work I've ever done." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper. "We're all marked by living. Ophelia, your scars just happen to be where people can see them. But that doesn't make them shameful, it makes them honest." Ophelia reached out tentatively, her fingertips barely brushing the long scar across Cornelius's ribs. His skin was warm under her touch, and she could feel his heartbeat strong and steady and reassuring. "Does it hurt?" she whispered. "Not anymore. Sometimes in winter, when the weather changes, I feel a twinge, but mostly I forget it's there." He covered her hand with his, pressing her palm flat against his chest. "Do you know what I thought about every night for 2 years? lying in my bed alone?" She shook her head, mesmerized by the feeling of his heart beating against her palm. "Thought about this moment, our wedding night, but not the way you might think." His voice grew softer, more intimate. "I thought about you trusting me enough to let me see you. All of you. Without shame, without hiding. I thought about showing you that every inch of you is precious to me." The storm outside had gentled to a steady patter of rain, and the lightning had moved on, leaving only the soft glow of the oil lamp to illuminate the cabin. In that golden light, with his scarred hands holding hers against his unmarked chest, Ophelia felt something shift inside Hertha, last walls around her heart finally crumbling. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Not of you, but I don't know how. To be someone's wife, I don't know how to be beautiful for you." Cornelius's eyes searched her face, taking in every detail, the unmarked skin, the scarred tissue, the tears still clinging to her lashes, the hope finally beginning to shine through her fear. "You don't have to be anything for me except yourself. The real you, the one who's been hiding for 2 years?" He rose from the bed and moved around the cabin, extinguishing all but one small candle. The room fell into intimate semi-darkness, shadows dancing on the log walls. When he returned to her, he knelt again, his hands gentle on her ankles as he began unlacing her wedding shoes. "Tell me about your dreams," he said quietly, his fingers working with careful reverence. "The good ones, from before. What did you want our life to look like?" Ophelia closed her eyes, letting herself remember dreams she'd buried under layers of shame and self-doubt. "I wanted a small house with a garden. I wanted to grow vegetables and flowers, enough to share with neighbors. I wanted children who would help me tend the plants and learn the names of everything growing." Her shoes came off, and Cornelius's hands moved to the buttons at the back of her wedding dress. Each button released with a small sigh, and she felt herself slowly unwinding, years of tension leaving her body. "I wanted to sing while I worked," she continued, her voice growing dreamy. "I wanted our children to grow up hearing music in their home, knowing they were loved. I wanted Sunday dinners with family and Christmas mornings with presents under a tree we cut ourselves." "What else?" Cornelius asked, his breath warm against her neck as he worked the last buttons free. "I wanted to grow old with you. I wanted to sit on a porch when we're 70, watching our grandchildren play in the yard and still feel lucky that you chose me," her voice caught. "I thought the accident had killed all those dreams." The dress fell away from her shoulders, pooling around her waist. Cornelius's hands stilled on her back, and she could feel him taking in the sight of her, not just her physical form, but the woman she was revealing herself to be. "Those dreams aren't dead," he said firmly. "They're just waiting for us to claim them." He turned her gently to face him, his hands cupping her face with infinite tenderness. In the candlelight, with his calloused thumbs brushing away her tears, Ophelia finally saw herself reflected in his eyes, not as a broken woman, but as someone beloved, someone chosen, someone worthy of every dream she'd ever dared to dream. "Welcome home, Mrs. Blackthorne," he whispered against her lips, and for the first time in 2 years, Ophelia believed she truly was. 3 years later, Ophelia stood in her garden at sunrise, her hands deep in rich earth, coaxing life from seeds she'd planted the week before. The morning light caught the scar along her jawline, but she no longer turned away from the sun. Instead, she tilted her face toward its warmth, humming softly as she worked. "Mama, look." Their 8-month-old son, Fletcher, toddled toward her on unsteady legs, his chubby fist clutching a handful of wildflowers he'd picked from the meadow behind their house. His hair was Cornelius's dark brown, but his eyes were her violet, and when he smiled, both dimpled cheeks showed his father's stubborn chin. "Beautiful flowers for my beautiful boy," Ophelia said, scooping him up and settling him on her hip. Fletcher immediately reached for her face, his tiny fingers tracing the familiar landscape of her scar with the casual acceptance of a child who'd never known her any other way. "Pretty mama," he said solemnly, as he did every morning, patting her scarred cheek with one muddy hand. "Pretty mama," she agreed, kissing his forehead. The sound of an axe biting wood echoed from behind the house where Cornelius was splitting logs for winter. The rhythmic thunk-thunk was interrupted by his rich baritone voice singing the same hymn she'd hummed while gardening. amazing grace. Fletcher giggled and tried to sing along, his baby voice creating a joyful cacophony that made Ophelia's heart swell. "Let's go see Papa," she said, hiking Fletcher higher on her hip as they walked around the house. Cornelius paused mid-swing when he saw them approaching, his face breaking into the grin that still made her stomach flutter after all these years. Sweat gleamed on his chest, and wood chips clung to his dark hair. He set down the axe and opened his arms, and Fletcher launched himself from Ophelia's hip with the fearless confidence of a child who knew he would always be caught. "There's my boy," Cornelius said, tossing Fletcher into the air and catching him, both of them laughing. "Did you help Mama with the garden? Flowers?" Fletcher announced, showing off his wilted bouquet. "For you," Ophelia said, stepping into the circle of Cornelius's free arm. Even after 3 years of marriage, she still marveled at how perfectly she fit against his side, how natural it felt to be held by him. "Mrs. Henderson stopped by yesterday while you were in town," she said, accepting his kiss on her temple. Cornelius raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Henderson had been one of the worst gossips. In the years following Ophelia's accident, one of those who'd cross the street rather than face her directly. She wanted to know if I'd consider joining the church ladies' auxiliary. Apparently they need someone to organize the Christmas pageant. Ophelia's smile was soft but proud. She said, "I have a gift for bringing people together." "You tell her," Cornelius asked, though his grin suggested he already knew. "I told her I'd be honored." Ophelia reached up to brush a wood chip from his hair. "I also told her that Fletcher would be one of the angels in the pageant, and she'd better get used to seeing our family front and center." Cornelius threw back his head and laughed, the sound echoing off the mountains that surrounded their small valley. "That's my fearless wife." "Not fearless," Ophelia corrected, watching Fletcher try to feed one of his flowers to a curious chicken. "Just finally awake. I spent so many years seeing myself through other people's eyes that I forgot I had my own." The morning sun climbed higher, painting their small homestead in golden light. The garden stretched before them, heavy with vegetables they'd grown together. The house Cornelius had built with his own hands stood solid and welcoming behind them. And somewhere in the meadow beyond, wildflowers grew in abundance, ready to be picked by small hands and offered with innocent love. "Do you remember our wedding night?" Cornelius asked quietly, his arm tightening around her waist. "When you apologized for being ugly?" Ophelia leaned into him, watching their son chase chickens with the single-minded determination of toddlerhood. "Remember you showing me the mirror? I still have it, on my shaving stand. Every morning when I'm getting ready for the day, I see that carved lightning around the edge, and I remember what you taught me, what I taught you." She looked up at him in surprise. "Oh, that love isn't about seeing perfection," Cornelius said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's about seeing truth. The truth is, you were never ugly, not even for a moment. You were just a lightning-struck woman who forgot how to see her own beauty." Fletcher stumbled and fell, scraping his knee on a rock. His wail of distress brought both parents running, but it was Ophelia he reached for first, his arms wrapping around her neck as she scooped him up and kissed away his tears. "All better now," she murmured against his hair. "Mama's got you," as she comforted there. Son Cornelius watched his wife with wonder that hadn't dimmed in all their years together. Here was the woman who'd whispered apologies for her appearance on their wedding night, radiating such confidence and maternal strength that their son instinctively turned to her for comfort. The scar was still there, would always be there. But now it was simply part of her story, not the ending, but a chapter that had led to everything beautiful that followed. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk, Fletcher asleep between them, Ophelia began to sing, not the tentative, shame-filled whisper of their wedding night, but the full, rich voice that had once filled church sanctuaries and now filled their home with joy. Cornelius closed his eyes and listened, remembering the mirror he'd carved, the lightning he'd captured in oak, and the woman who'd learned to see herself as he'd always seen her, not damaged, but transformed, not ugly, but unforgettable, not broken, but beautifully, powerfully whole.